Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show for a special programme 1 year after the storming of the Capitol. 20 years ago, Colonel Wilkerson was at the epicentre of decision-making as Chief of Staff to the then US Secretary of State, the late General Colin Powell. Now a distinguished professor at William and Mary College, what is his assessment of his old boss's contribution to statecraft, and also his view on the trends in American politics just 1 year after the assault on the citadel of American democracy? But first, to your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week on COVID and whether there is a single vaccine solution on the horizon. Well, we have some conflicting views. Lorna says, new science which completely ignores the old science for the purpose of a new agenda. Sandy says, very informative. Let the scientists talk and it makes sense. And finally, Eileen says, another very interesting show tonight. Great experts adding to our understanding of COVID. Now, the death of Colin Powell last autumn brought a rare moment of bipartisanship in American politics, with the notable exception of President Trump. All sides united to praise the substantial contribution of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State to American military and political life. But what was his lasting impact? Alex is joined by the man who stood at the side of General Powell throughout his term of office, Colonel Laurence Wilkerson.
Colonel Laurence Wilkerson, what a great pleasure to have you once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Good to be with you.
Now, Colonel Wilkerson, since we last spoke, of course, your old boss, someone who you stood beside in his terms of office, General Colin Powell, has died. What perspective do you think and contribution, lasting contribution, will his life and times make to American and world affairs?
I think there are two obvious to me anyway, contributions that Powell made. And the first one is the one I would rank the highest, oddly enough, perhaps. His contribution to the forward movement of African Americans in America and in the world, as far as that goes. He was a man who rose to the pinnacle of military power and just short of the pinnacle of civilian power in the largest, most powerful empire in the world. And he could have been the man who rose to that very pinnacle in 1995. Both parties were recruiting him. Both parties had set up an apparatus that had an office in every state in the Union. And both wanted him, as they wanted Eisenhower, for example, post-World War II. And he decided not to run. And the second is the fact that he was a great American and always will be remembered by historians as a great American. He has that blemish, as he called it, on his career, the presentation at the United Nations, which represented the ultimate blemish, his support for a war that truly was a sad and disastrous strategic decision for the United States. But nonetheless, his legacy will persevere, and I think historians will look on him positively, not unlike the way they look on Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall in terms of military leaders. He was a great American.
If we look at the two black American men who have risen to the very top of the military and political life in the United States, Colin Powell and Barack Obama, both have radiated a sense of essential decency, which has been very strong in terms of their reputation. In the case of General Powell, and looking at his term as Secretary of State, where you stood alongside him, as you did when he was chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was there a sense in which some of the snake oil salesmen around the presidency took advantage of that decency and that optimism about human nature that General Powell radiated?
When I first went to work for him in 1989, I consulted a young lady who was then working for Larry Garrett, the Secretary of the Navy at the time, but knew Powell rather well, and I knew she did. And around her fire in a townhome in Alexandria, Virginia one night, she said to me, "Beware of his naivete." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "He can be incredibly naive about the people around him because he believes sometimes far too long in their decency." I found that to be true. And if he had a weakness that was almost like the Achilles heel, if you will, it was the fact that he thought George Bush, even Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and others, and testified to this to me in personal conversation on a number of occasions, were fundamentally good human beings. They were just short of criminals, in my view. And I'm not so sure he didn't come to that observation too late, but I'm not so sure he didn't come to a similar observation. Same I could say for George Tenet, the director of the CIA. He had assembled around him some of the most malevolent characters, in my view, in post-World War II American history. And he was naive about some of them.
Looking first at General Powell's military record, how important is it for the United States that an African American can rise to the very top of the military echelon, and indeed, of course, become known for a doctrine, a military doctrine, which is accorded to very few generals, as was to Powell. How important? What message does that give in the American military about equality and meritocracy?
We thought, Powell and I and others around us, other black generals like Julius Becton, for example, that it was a monumental achievement in that regard. But I think both of us, Powell and myself, fell off in that estimation rather rapidly after the Secretariat. And the reason we did was because we monitored what our Army and the other services too were doing with regard to what people have called affirmative action, but it wasn't affirmative action in the military. It was simply making sure promotion boards had black officers to promote. It's a constant battle, especially when you have the record of this minority, dismal that it is in this country.
And then in his second great appointment as Secretary of State, you mentioned Woolwich, Powell, Cheney, Rumsfeld. They were all political operators. You mentioned naivety as part of an attractive but nonetheless aspect of General Powell's character. Did he have the ability to show down that group of people, or was it very difficult with a young and relatively inexperienced president?
I'll quote his remarks to the National War College, the preeminent military college in our structure, in 1991 when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He stood on the stage in front of all those colonels arrayed before him, sailors, soldiers, Marines, airmen, and he said, "They call me the political general. Yes, they call me the political general. Guilty as charged, and I'm the chairman, and they ain't." That was his own estimation of his ability to survive in such an environment. But as I said before, and it wasn't just naivete, but that was a huge part of it, his belief in the basic decency and humanity and truthfulness and honesty of other people around him at that level of power was debilitating. He didn't understand when someone like Donald Rumsfeld lied to him repeatedly. He made excuses for Rumsfeld. He didn't understand when a former protege of his, Condi Rice, refused to discipline the national security decision-making system because she understood if she did, she'd be taking the side of Powell on occasion. And if she took his side against Rumsfeld and Cheney, she would alienate the president and she would sour her chances of being Powell's replacement whenever that might come. He didn't understand that 3 or 4 of these political operators, all motivated by other than the things he was motivated by, were too much, even for his political skills.
What would you rate as his greatest success as Secretary of State?
2 things, really, and both have gotten little writ in our media. One would be the global HIV/AIDS program, which he managed to convince, and I must say President Bush was inclined to be convinced, over Cheney's and others' objections, to add to the global HIV/AIDS and indeed the U.S. AIDS funds incredibly. It's one of the reasons why Bush is still revered in Africa. And then the second one would be something that, as I said, just hasn't gotten to play, and that is his preservation of a good relationship with China throughout the 4 years, even though the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President were attempting to start a new Cold War, principally through Chen Shui-bian, the president in Taiwan, who was seeking an independence referendum and crossing one of Beijing's red lines. We actually had to do that almost every week for 4 years, defeat the vice president's attempts to get Taiwan to be a casus belli with Beijing, and began a really hot new Cold War.
Looking at the presentation, the infamous presentation at the United Nations, which you, of course, played a very substantial part in, how is it possible that there wasn't a deal of suspicion about some of the information that General Powell and yourself were being fed by the intelligence services and others?
You're looking at the Director of Central Intelligence 24/7 almost for 7 straight days and nights. And the Director of Central Intelligence has marshaled the French, the Israelis, the Germans, the Jordanians, and a host of others to convince Powell that Saddam Hussein does have certain weapons of mass destruction. And most importantly, again, I can't overemphasize this, does have an active nuclear weapons program. This is what happened. And only later do we understand that Tenet cherry-picked the French he was talking to, cherry-picked the Jordanians he was talking to, and so forth, and was not representing those intelligence entities at all as state intelligence entities. He was representing people he could cajole within their ranks to give him some sort of confirmation of what he was telling Powell. I think Tenet lied. I think he outright lied. Others have said to me, no, he was convinced himself. There was such a wealth of circumstantial evidence. I don't think so. I think he lied. I think he wanted to lie because the first client, the man who preserved him as director through presidential change, an unheard of thing in many respects, he was serving that first client, and he read that first client's mind very well. He wanted to go to war, and Tenet was going to give him the evidence to do it. And Powell got caught in that. You can say we both were naive in not being able to challenge the Director of Central Intelligence and all these other assets that were marshaled to convince Powell, and indeed convince the president too, vice president being one of them, that Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction. But I would argue, I'll argue to my grave, that it's pretty hard to stand up to all this wealth of intelligence expertise, so to speak, marshaled against you.
And can you tell us, to your knowledge at least, did the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, at that time commit himself to stand shoulder to shoulder with President Bush in a war in Iraq the year before the United Nations presentation? Do you have any insight as to where prior commitments had been given by the British Prime Minister to the American President?
Yes. Blair was doing things, and I remember vividly a couple of things he did that he directed his intelligence community to do that augmented and amplified what Bush wanted to do in terms of presenting the intelligence on Saddam Hussein, and in terms of ensuring the president that he would be with him come thick or thin.
And finally, Colonel Wilkerson, would it be reasonable to say that Colin Powell is the greatest president that America never had?
Absolutely. I think sometimes with great sadness brings tears to the corners of my eyes. How different 2000, 2001, 2002 would have been had he been elected and served 2 terms. We would not have had what we had. We certainly would not have had that strategic catastrophe of Iraq. And whoever followed Colin probably would have been in a different set of circumstances too, whether they went through 9/11 or he went through 9/11. It would have made a difference perhaps, but it would have been a different world. It would have been a different empire. It's sad to think about it.
Join us after the break when I'll be speaking to Colonel Laurence Wilkerson about the current state of American politics.
Welcome back. 1 year ago, the very foundations of the American Republic were shaking in the aftermath of the storming of the Capitol. For a perspective on these events, Alex is interviewing Colonel Laurence Wilkerson, the former Chief of Staff to the late General Colin Powell.
Colonel Laurence Wilkerson, we're now just a year after the storming of the Capitol, the assault on the citadel of American democracy. Stands the Republic where it did?
I think not. And just your use of the expression, quote, the citadel of democracy, unquote, is really inaccurate, I think. The Congress of the United States, the legislative branch in which our founding fathers thought most power would reside, because it is the direct representative of the people, which is, after all, what democracy is supposed to be all about, is defunct.
But how can it be, Colonel Wilkerson, that just a year after the part farcical, part tragic attempted popular uprising by an outgoing president, we can have opinion polls showing President Trump the favourite to become the next president? How on earth can that be in any universe?
Good question. I watched CNN's report on it last night, and I was stunned at how graphic they were able to be about how much he has come back and how he will likely be the candidate for the Republicans and indeed probably be the president in 2024. It's astonishing. But it shows you how broken our democracy is. Not just January the 6th is necessary for that. This whole process is necessary to understand that. What we have right now is we have the three bodies of power in the United States, equal power. In the Constitution, equal power. The Supreme Court, the legislature, and the executive, in the hands of or about to be in the hands of what you just described. And I'm not being too exaggerating with regard to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is now in the hands of what I would call the corporate complex in America. They're also in the hands of what I would call Opus Dei like Catholicism. It's astonishing what we've allowed to happen to this body of our government, which above all is supposed to be independent and stand aloof from politics and from partisan mongering, if you will. And yet here they are, representative of the very thing I'm talking about. So I lament the future for this democracy, if it even can be called a democracy, on the path that it's walking right now. I don't see how it survives.
But how can it be that President Joe Biden, and there can't be any more streetwise president in terms of knowing his way around Congress and given his experience, how can it be with all the power of the presidency, all the knowledge that President Biden has accumulated over the years, that he cannot navigate, apparently, successfully his way around that? Or are we still to get the best to come from Joe Biden?
This is an interregnum in what I just said. In some respects, it, as Trump would say, Donald Trump would say, it's an astonishing interregnum. It's an illegal interregnum. But what's happened is Biden is against what I just said. He's against the court on the one hand and the legislature on the other hand. As long as the legislature's in the hands of Mitch McConnell, which it really truly still is, he's not going to be able to get anything done. And as he is unable to get anything done, his polls are going to drop and drop and drop. And the American people are not going to reward him with any kind of acclaim, let alone re-election or his successor's re-election, whether it be Kamala Harris or whomever. So we're headed into that, and he's going down like the Titanic as we head into it.
But how about the Republican Party, the grand old party? I mean, there cannot be unanimity of view that former President Trump also represents the future. There must be forces within republicanism that say, well, perhaps there's an alternative way forward.
I think there are some Republicans around the periphery, if you will, particularly out west, where environment, clean water, and such motivate them, are not fully engaged, but they aren't going to survive unless they appear to be. And that appearance is going to coat and glue everyone together. I think we're looking at a Republican Party that has become exactly what George Washington predicted the factions, as he called parties, would become. More interested on a 24/7 basis in its own survival, its own power, its own prerogatives than it is the country. The country be damned from that perspective. And that's what we're looking at. And we're looking at it in all three branches of government.
And how about, what does all this mean for American geopolitics as the world's still dominant superpower? I mean, does it mean that America is going to confront China in Asia, confront Russia in Europe, confront Americans in America? I mean, what's happening with the geopolitical role of the world superpower?
We don't need this tension with China. We don't need this tension with Putin and Russia. Much of it is our own fault for missteps that we made from Bill Clinton on. But we've got it. And what we're doing, rather than trying to tamp it down, these latest diplomatic initiatives notwithstanding, is we're exacerbating it. The so-called pseudo-color revolution in Kazakhstan is a perfect example. It reminds me of what we tried to do in Venezuela under Trump. This is not the way to do things, and yet they're doing it. It's almost as if they have this stereotype, and Biden would be the one to perpetuate it, from the last days of the Cold War and the early days of the post-Cold War period that says, as Bush said in the 2002 National Security Strategy, George W. Bush, we can't allow anybody an inch. We have to smack them if they take an inch toward our prerogatives. And by the way, we identify our prerogatives, whether it be in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, anywhere in the world that anyone is going to gain a march on us, we have to stop them. Stop them with sanctions, stop them with the military, however we can do it. But this is the behavior of an empire trying to preserve the status quo at any consequence. It's a disaster almost as, and could surpass greatly were it to turn nuclear, the domestic one.
You've expressed concern about the suggestion from some elements in the military that nuclear weapons could be a feasible tactical weapon for conflict. Is that a real body of thought that's emerging in power circles in the United States?
It is, and I've been privy to it in a number of places, think tanks, and actually within the military ranks. Well, I think we know pretty well from experience and think tankery, if you will, that escalation is inevitable. And so you start using nuclear weapons, you're going down that road to annihilation. Whether you do it with China or you do it with Russia or whatever, Russia and our arsenals together probably number over 8, 9, 10,000 weapons. That's clearly enough to probably destroy the human race, if not through actual blast and radiological fallout through the nuclear winter that would occur after such an exchange.
Colonel Wilkerson, finally, you're known for your acute observations and quite pessimistic analysis of the developments in American politics and in geopolitics. Can you point to any signs of optimism and hope in the American body politic? Other developments which you turn to and say, well, you know, perhaps that's going to take the greatest democratic experiment in world history onto a new and better plane?
I can, and it's called the demos. It's called the people. I'm involved in, and I know of other movements that are ongoing right now. One is a constitutional amendment to virtually eliminate Citizens United, the decision by our Supreme Court, disastrous decision that put so much polluting money into politics. And we've got 21, 22 states already. You need 3/4 of the states to ratify a constitutional amendment. And I've had people say, well, you're not going to amend the Constitution. Au contraire, in the 20th century, we amended it several times, if you know your history, to allow women to vote, to put prohibition in place, to annul prohibition. We have done it before, we can do it again. And there are other things like this that are coming from the grassroots and the grass tops that give me a great deal of hope that our democracy is not dead yet, and that eventually we will achieve some of these purposes, and it'll be long after I'm in my grave probably, but we'll see a resurrection of what is supposed to be the essence of democracy, the people. Now there's that counter that 75 million of us seem to be on this circuit of I'll believe anything Donald Trump says, most of which is a lie, but they can be countered. There is a small majority of Americans who don't feel that way. And I'd say it's between 55 and 60%. And another 10% is probably persuadable if you do the right things and present them with the right opportunities. I think we can get it back. It's going to take a fight and it's going to take some time, but I think we can get it back. I'm not optimistic that ultimately we will. That's just me, though. I'm fully willing to stand back and say I underestimated the people. They did do it. I won't be here to do that, but I'd like to anticipate the possibility.
Well, a revolution is good for a state from time to time in a positive direction. Colonel Laurence Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. By any standard, Colin Powell was an outstanding and groundbreaking military leader and Secretary of State. However, he knew himself that his career would be forever tarnished by the infamous presentation to the United Nations in justification of the war in Iraq. For all that, there are few who would dispute that people of his calibre and decency are in fundamentally short supply in America, and then just about every other nation's politics. Meanwhile, a mere year after the part farcical and part tragic Trumpian attempt at a popular coup, remarkably, it is a Democrat incumbent who is at bay and the former president who prowls around Mar-a-Lago plotting his political comeback. It is a sign of near desperation that many Democratic lawmakers are looking to the Attorney General Merrick Garland or New York Attorney Letitia James to provide salvation by prosecuting the Donald for insurrection or possible bank and insurance fraud. With Trump now a solid favourite to become the next president, it might be better to work out how to confront and defeat the former president politically. But for now, from myself, Alex, and all at the show, thank you for watching, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.